Rabbi. Well, on the topic of quarantine, our question this week for the ancients is, what would they think about people violating state and city guidelines about quarantine?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they were pretty into state and city guidelines themselves. um, so yeah, in general, the ancients, especially the ancient rabbis who lived under the Romans,
Mhm,
they were pretty clear that you should follow what the authorities tell you to do.
mhm,
And you, of course, mainly because they knew that they lived in a marginal kind of position in their society and that they had no standing to try to tell the Romans what should and shouldn't be done.
mhm,
So they were big on following what the state tells you to do. I think beyond that, they really were clear that health and life were the most important things. And so pretty much anything that would preserve your health or especially preserve your life, even if it's something that normally would be prohibited up
mhm,
to limits, um, you should do it. And people who violate that and put not only their life at risk, but other people's lives at risk, which is what people violate quarantine orders are doing, that's a really big no-no as far as the ancients are concerned. Like you might say that you have authority over your own life, but you certainly don't have authority over other people's lives. So
mhm.
you really should be following all that stuff. And of course, there were plagues in ancient times, and they lived through these things. So they knew, and they knew a lot more about medicine than we usually give them credit for 2,000 years ago. So yeah, I think they would have some really choice words to say about people who violated quarantine orders. And they also did not hold back. We sometimes have this idea that in ancient times people weren't like us and they didn't go off the handle once in a while, but the ancient rabbis, even in writing, sometimes went way off on folks who did things they didn't approve of. So I can only imagine the wonderful stream of Aramaic invective they would unleash on such people.
Well, I guess that brings you to another question about, if they thought that they should abide by the Roman law, even if they found the Roman law unethical, what does that say today about people violating quarantine in order to attend Black Lives Matter protests or
Mm.
engage in civil disobedience, which does violate the laws and might put people's health at risk, but they think, answers to a higher ethical standard?
Right. They really struggled with the idea of protest
Mm,
and violating the law in order to save it, violating the law in order to save their own idea of what law was. So, on the one hand, they have this statement called Dina de Malchuta Dina, which means the law of the government is the law, i.e., you should follow it. On the
mhm,
other hand, they spent a lot of time calling out either implicitly or rarely explicitly um, Roman law and saying it was unjust, unethical. It's just that as a minority group in a oppressed situation, they were reluctant to take it on directly. So
mhm,
we are in a much different position now, especially living in the United States, in a country where theoretically, at least, our rights are protected and our right to protest is protected. Then I think they'd feel a little less compunction about participating in protests that even does violate the law, because they, within the area they controlled, within Jewish law, they were very clear that often the law needs to be violated in order to save other parts of the law. And it's one of the tricky things about Jewish law, that people often have the idea that Jewish law is sort of strict, like you have to follow everything that happens. And there's almost no part of Jewish law where there aren't exceptions,
mhm,
because other values come into play,
mhm,
as we might expect, right? So even something like we were talking about before about the laws of keeping kosher, but in situations of food scarcity, in situations of medical need, they were really clear that the law actually requires you to violate the laws of keeping kosher in order to follow the general principle of preserving life. So all these things are always being weighed against each other. And sometimes it's a tough call, sometimes it's an easier call. But I think for them, probably the Black Lives Matter protests would be a pretty easy call in terms of the fortunate situation that people are in our current moment.
mhm.